But for now, why we came to this webinar. We'll talk a lot about tigers. That's a shot that I took in Kana. So what you'll see, a lot of the photos on this webinar, we tried to just add the ones that we took on the fam trip so that you can see it. It's live. It's not a marketing photo. These are the photos from the fam participants. So sometimes you'll hear us give shout outs to some of the participants on this PowerPoint. Just to give you the lay of the land, this is a map of northern and central India. Up here is what a lot of people would call the cultural golden triangle. So Delhi, Agra, and Jaipur. It's probably the most marketed itinerary that you can find. A lot of people sell it. It's an easy sell. It's relatively close to each other. You'll see other points of interest in Rajasthan, like Jodhpur and Udaipur, but down here at the bottom in Madhya Pradesh are the parks where we spent a lot of time in Bandhavgarh, Kana, and Pench. So we're going to focus our tiger conversation right in this area. But India does have a lot more other parks than these 3 parks, but these are just the ones that we happen to focus on. You can see that right here. So this is just a map of Madhya Pradesh, and I just put in the red box where the parks that we visited. Cool. And of course, our story isn't complete if you didn't talk about the 3 generations of tiger conservation in India, starting with the gentleman in the top left, which is actually Amit's grandfather, Kailash Sankala, who was basically the person that led into India's Project Tiger. Essentially, his grandfather is the one that set aside pieces of land to conserve tiger that allowed us to do what we're doing today. And Amit, maybe you can talk a little bit about this as well.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mark. My grandfather actually started something called Project Tiger, which is 50 years of Project Tiger is happening in the first week of April this year. And the idea of Project Tiger was to, set aside land throughout the country for tiger and its habitat and remove human-animal conflict back in 1971. And it was spearheaded by the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi at that time. And he was the first director of Project Tiger. So he created the first 9 tiger reserves of the country. By 73, it became illegal to kill tigers in the wild. And today we've gone from 9 tiger reserves to about 50 tiger reserves in the country. So it's been quite a successful program, and what we have conserved tigers and all that means we have 50 national parks in the country which have tigers in them, wild tigers in them. And our national parks are, when we compare Africa and India, are quite big. Like Kana, he's talking about, Marc just talked about, is about 2,200 square kilometers. Bandhavgarh is about 1,100 square kilometers. So they are massive tracts of land. But the biggest problem that was happening was, the villages and the people were also growing. So to be able to relocate villages back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even today, into areas which are more inhabited by people, and removing that human-animal conflict was the essential thing. And that's what makes the national parks of today. So I was quite fortunate that my grandfather started that whole movement through the years, and today we have 50 tiger reserves.
Awesome. And when you get a chance, please make sure you watch the documentary called Tigerland. You'll see Amit there. You'll hear the story about tiger conservation in India. You'll see some familiar faces that we talked about, like Dimple and their son Jay, who's a big star in that documentary. So when you get a chance, please, I highly recommend watching Tigerland. And all that conservation work allowed us to have this. So this is what you'll typically see when you spend, we spent 6 days on safari on this trip, and we saw a good amount of predators, from different tiger sightings to even leopard. I think this is a sighting from Chris's phone, if I'm not mistaken. That's why it's a little bit blurry, that sighting of the leopard in the bottom center. We also saw Asiatic wild dogs. Actually, we had a couple of sightings, which was amazing. We tracked them for quite some time. And then we also saw some jackals. So the predator sightings were absolutely amazing. And these are all photos from fan participants, thanks to Chris, Bert, Katie, and Tad taking some of these photos. And to give you a bit of a context, I think my vehicle saw 6 tigers in total, and 2 of them were very, very good premium quality sighting, like where we were able to get these amazing photographs. But the other 4 were average to not so good. The other sighting that we had, right, it was outside the gate, and I think it was in Bandhavgarh or Kana, and you couldn't really see the tiger, but all the guys kind of just say, hey, there's a tiger right by the gate. And the next thing you know, they hide by the bush, right? So some of the sightings that we had were quite fast. You couldn't get your camera ready right away, but in some of them, we were able to get some really amazing shots and really get to spend some time with them. Here's just a little video of that male tiger where we were able to get that shot up front. They just walk right by us. You can see how gorgeous and beautiful it is. And it's a cat. It's a big cat. And this is actually a pretty funny video because you'll see shortly it gets scared of its own tail. It jumps.
It demystifies this really burly tiger, right?
There you go. Yeah, this is a video taken by Katie from the fam. And you can get up close to that tiger. And we probably spent a good 5 minutes with that tiger before it went away. So it can be that quick, but the quality of those sightings are absolutely amazing. And apart from tigers, you also see a really good diversity of other mammals in the different parks that we visited, from the spotted deer to the barashinga that we talked about, gaur, sambar deer. Can't remember what the one in the middle is called. Amit, you got to help me out here.
The gaur, and the one below nilgai is the blue bull.
Yeah, blue bull, exactly. So there are different species all over, and absolutely gorgeous mammals that you can photograph, as well as the little ones. So you get a lot of langur monkeys jumping around. They're quite cute, very similar to the vervet monkeys that you would find in Africa. You'll also see some of the wild boar around, and mongoose. So they're quite common. And for birders, we were able to get some amazing bird shots. The bird on the top left, no, it's not a lilac-breasted roller. This is the Indian roller, not to be confused with the lilac-breasted. But we actually saw also a ton of jungle owlet. These little owls that you see just about everywhere. Just amazing sightings, great colors on the kingfisher as well as on the woodpeckers, and some really good raptor and the predator sightings as well for the birds. Yeah, for birders, I highly recommend. I checked off quite a lot on my list here. I want to talk a little bit about the sceneries, especially if you have clients that are really into photography. Because of the lay of the land, you have the teak and the sal forest. What this creates for anyone that's really into photography is a really good depth of field. When we talk about the Mara and the Serengeti, it's all about the open space. On your photograph, you get that nice negative space. In India, especially the parks that we visited, you can put your subject in some really interesting backgrounds. And what's really cool about these places, there's a lot of the roads create a lot of these really cool leading lines where you could put that tiger in the middle of it and create for just a really good photograph. The one on the left is actually a shot taken by Tad with the sun just coming out. You see the rays of the sun in front of the vehicle. This is taken, I think, Tad, you took this from your phone, right? It's absolutely gorgeous shot. You don't have to be that skilled, sorry, Tad, to be a photographer to get these kinds of shots.
No offense taken, I'm very unskilled, and the phone helps, but the subject and the sunlight coming through those trees, I mean, could have taken a million of those shots. It was incredible.
And you can put them, there's a lot of these really interesting places like old banyan trees with things hanging around, just absolutely amazing. And other kind of cool thing that you can find in India, especially if you want to market the place, you'll see them referred to as the Big Seven of India. So you can see obviously the Bengal tiger. We saw some leopards. Fortunately, we didn't see a the sloth bear. It's Baloo. If you read the Jungle Book, they've also got the rhinos, Asiatic lions. Of course, we saw some of the wild dogs and the Asiatic elephants. So, there are these other species that we didn't get to see, because some of them you have to go to different national parks to see them. But just goes to show the diversity that India has to offer. And what we did those 6 days in 3 parks, barely scratched the surface, right? So there's a lot more to discover when you go to India. Okay, now moving on. We want to do a little bit of a deep dive on what's different in India compared to your typical safari in Africa. As Tad mentioned earlier, the wildlife sightings are amazing, and it's not any better or worse, I would say, than your safaris in Africa. I think the main difference is how you do it. The how is what's different. And when selling India, I think it's really important to keep an open mind, especially for Africa safari sellers, because some of the safari styles and conservation models might work in Africa. It might not necessarily work in a place like India. Because for instance, if you take a look at the Masai Mara, right? If you look at the number of visitors that are in the park at any given day, majority of those visitors are international travelers. But in India, we heard a really amazing stat that I think, what was that? I think 70 or 80% of the people in the tiger parks in India are actually domestic visitors, right? So tigers for Indian locals, right? So that's really one of the main differences.
And that's also one of the main success stories of why it is like that. So the thing is, we come from a country with a very strong sort of middle class, which travels. They love to travel. And especially during the pandemic, you would think that, national parks, and especially in Africa, were struggling, no revenue coming in, all those problems. In India, it was the opposite. It was like Indians could not travel abroad, so they visited the national parks in big numbers. So what happens in the US, where every US national park or remote property was full because of US travelers. So India has that. And the thing is, there is a mindset of saying, Indian travelers could be, annoying, but actually, I mean, Marc and Tad can share that the general sighting that when we pass a Jeep or something like that, I mean, Alexa's here laughing, so maybe I'll let her comment as well on this point. But Alexa's was probably louder than the Indian clients as well. So. but yeah, no, it's actually quite a good experience. I've been to Africa 10 times, so I can compare what the experience and what the Indian in Africa is a little bit different. I don't mean to be racist here, but towards my own kind, I know how the new travelers are evolving, and I think they're more educated and they take more sort of appreciating everything. Let's put it that way.
Exactly. So yeah, just some key differences, and we'll talk about this in great detail. So highly controlled and regulated. The safaris in India are quite controlled by the national parks. There's a limited number of vehicles and permits allowed in the park. So when you're selling, and this is important when you're working with Amit, to make sure you get those permits, whenever possible, because kind of think of it as similar to gorilla trekking permits, where they become limited, especially in the high season. As we mentioned, there's a different conservation model. There's not really any private game reserve or conservancies. There's one that we'll talk about later, but that thing doesn't really, you don't see that too often in India. We want to talk a little bit about tiger tracking and game viewing, right? When you're in the Mara or your Sabi Sands, you drive around, you're gonna see your lions, your leopards, your big game in 3 hours. In India, what I really loved about it is you brought back that whole idea of tracking, listening to the sounds of the jungle, paying attention. In some cases, we were quiet for like a good half an hour, listening to the alarm calls, right? That gives you a little bit of an excitement when you're doing your safaris in India. And we'll also talk a little bit about how the game drives work and the permits, and because you have to come in and out in specific times of the day. Right, so I just want to go into this next slide just to give you an idea of some of the regulations in the parks. This is a map of Bandhavgarh, and you can see they have divided it into 3 different zones. So basically, the way it works, you know, the parks will issue a set amount of permits that are allowed to visit in each zone for game drive. Right, so that's what we mean when it's highly regulated. So Amit, you want to add something to that as well?
Yeah, only 20% of the national parks in India is actually open for tourism, and the highest density of tigers anywhere in the world actually in these particular parks that you're going to, sort of Bandhavgarh, Kana, these particular areas. And this Magdi, Tala, Khitoli, these are zones that have been opened over time as the parks have expanded. So, you know, every year, let's say a mother has cubs in different parks, different mothers have cubs, you know, more sightings happen, a male tiger dominates in a particular area. So that knowledge is actually very important. If you book a general trip, let's just say with a culture operator, you know, who is used to doing the cultural itinerary, such things, that knowledge isn't there with them. You know, the knowledge, because we have a base in all these parks, it depends on whichever camp you book in. And I'm not saying that one has to book into our camps. We are a full service company, so we'll book into, you know, the X and beyond camp or Samot Safari Lodge, or any sort of, depending on the caliber of the client, where do you spend your money on, which zone you should go to, all that sort of does matter. And then you can enhance these experiences to making it closer to an Africa experience by selling something called a full day exclusive permit, which Marc will talk about in a second. So these zones that you are given, like Tala, Magdi, Khitoli in this particular case, you know, you're restricted to that particular zone for the morning or the afternoon. So you go in the park at 6 o'clock in the morning and come out around 10:30. Then you go again 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, come back around sunset. And you're given a particular zone, so that way the vehicles are distributed and we don't have overcrowding vehicles over one particular tiger. You know, some zones have only 18 vehicles, some only have 15, some have 23. So it depends on the size of the zone, and that way the vehicles get distributed in that part of the park. And we can try different zones as well, just to give you guys a good diversity of the park. But what a full day permit does is gives you eternal access into the park all given times. You can go anywhere, any zone, you can enter before everybody, you can stay in the park in the afternoon, so the park is yours, which makes a huge difference. That if you're having an amazing tiger sighting at 9:30 in the morning and everybody now has to sort of leave because the park closes around 10:30, 11, you know, when they leave at 10 o'clock, you're still with your tiger or her cubs or whatever. They've come to drink water in the afternoon. You know, you have your exclusive tiger sightings. So there are ways of enhancing the experience to take it, you know, close to sort of exclusivity when you're trying to sell safaris in India.
Yeah, and what's good with working with Amit's team, and I was fortunate enough to spend some time in their office, is that, you know, they'll give you recommendations on what works best. So if you tell Amit's team that, hey, look, I got a photographer, these are my days, this is how logistics work, you know, we'll book the full day permits where it makes sense, right? You know, maybe you come in the afternoon and you just do an afternoon game drive, so you just book the half day permit, and the next 2-3 days we could book you all full day permits, or just in some of those days, right? So you have that flexibility working with Amit's team to make sure we put your clients in the right zones, in the right times, and giving them the right permits. Cool. So yeah, that just gives you hopefully a good lay of the land. The same thing applies when you're in Kana, and obviously likewise the same thing when you go to Pench. So it's a very, very similar style where they separate into different zones and you're only allowed to enter on those zones. And the one thing I wanted to add as well, some parks are more strict than others. Like for instance, in Bandhavgarh, we had to show our passports to make sure that we're on the vehicle that was designated to us, right? In Africa, you can kind of just go whenever you want, right? In India, that's very regulated and very controlled. So that's a good thing, I think, for those that operate safaris. Okay, cool. Then moving on to the type of vehicles that we use. So a lot of you guys might ask, hey, you know, what's with the small mini 4x4s? But you know what? You actually need to be in this vehicle, especially in this kind of terrain. So if you look back in the video that we just saw, that tiger was there on the road for like 2-3 minutes, and then it's gone. It's in the thicket. So you need to be able to maneuver and pivot really fast. So these small Suzuki Marudis can do that for you. So this is the video of pictures of us, waiting to get in the park. So you can see we have to wait at those designated times to get in, and everyone gets in at the same time, except if you have a full day permit, which allows you to be in the park. Okay. And here you can actually see the way Amit has set up the vehicles. You'll often hear him talk about having his own naturalist or a lodge naturalist, as well as the driver of the vehicle, and as well as the gate guide. So Amit, you want to talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, so all the vehicles are not owned by us. Generally, there's an employment scheme by the government which allows us to take 2 of the vehicles that we own into the park, and the rest we hire from the local roaster. It's actually quite a good place because the drivers have also taken an incentive to learning more about the birds and showing and learned English and developed very well over time. So we have chosen the people that we want to take in the park. That way, those are the particular drivers. Now, when we talk about gate guide, it means that the guide has to be taken from the local village in the area. So it's also, again, an employment guarantee scheme. The idea is that the involvement of the community is important when you're in India, because we don't have fenced parks. These are not private game reserves or anything. This is the jungle. Tigers come out into the village all the time. Elephants come out into the village. There are problems that happen. Hence, the revenue needs to flow back into the communities that are near the national parks. Hence, everything is done to enhance that employment within them. And that's why there is somebody who comes as a gate guide, as they call it. Some are very good and exceptional, who know all their birds, speak amazing English, and some don't even speak a word. But it is essential to have that person in the vehicle because of that. Having said that, we make sure that every vehicle has a very good English-speaking, articulate guide who can talk about alarm calls, safaris, and of course, not just about the park you're in, but generally wildlife in India. So somebody, an excellent guide, an exceptional guide, will either be your driver, your gate guide, or somebody from our camp who is going to be accompanying you. So that is our job to guarantee. These vehicles that you see, we never put more than 2 people in a row. That is 4 people per Jeep, as when it comes down to clients. That's sort of the limit that we play with, and keeping everybody comfortable. And just because it is closer to the ground, unlike Africa vehicles, and the amount of terrain that you're going to, the terrain is very different in India. It's not like the savannas of Africa where you can just turn a big Land Rover around anywhere. You have to move quickly when sightings happen. These Jeeps are the most ideal thing in that kind of a terrain, and quite comfortable. And many people on this fam trip, who are here, could probably also vouch for the difference. Yes, doesn't have the wide leg spaces of where you can put a tripod on, but photographers work very differently, and we customize things very separately for photographers, where only 2 people in a Jeep sit when it's a photography group. So we can talk about that separately based on somebody's interest on, is it photographers versus generalist clients.
And there are a handful of Land Cruisers out there, and I have to say, I never realized how loud diesel Land Cruisers are until I was in India in these Suzuki, because they're petrol and they're super quiet, and you can't hear them until they're really right up next to you, whereas you can hear the Land Cruiser that felt like miles away. So I think we actually, in this case, in India, as Amit said, for a whole host of reasons, these Suzuki Jeeps are far preferable. And certainly the noise is a big factor, being much quieter.
Cool. Another thing we wanted to talk about briefly is how important the community involvement is in the national parks. And this is a really good example that you can see at Jamtara, where when we went there, it was village day, or it was market day in the local village. And you can actually see Amit's staff from Jamtara, picking up produce in the local market. So there's it's really, really good synergy between the community and the safari operators within that area. And I want to talk a little bit about, what they would call the Kana Pench corridor and some of the conservation success that they've done here. I was just looking at some stats when Project Tiger started. The population was of the tigers. The first census, when it happened in 1972, there were only 1,800 tigers left in the wild. Prior to that, in 1947, there were about 40,000 tigers estimated. Now, when the Project Tiger started, the population went back up to 3,500, then went back down again because of, you know, habitat loss and some poaching. But now it sits at a healthy population of about, I think it was about 3,000 tigers in the wild in India. So you can see conservation happening right in front of your eyes. So I think that's super important to talk about. Amit, anything to add there?
Yeah, you know, the thing is we've been able to save tigers in pockets, and what we have saved in India is quite exceptional when it comes to tigers, leopards, wild dogs, bears, you know, snow leopards, Asiatic lions, wild elephants, wild buffaloes, sort of you name it, we have it. You know, the diversity of wildlife in India is quite incredible. It's just the safaris are not organized like they are in Africa, hence you never think of wildlife and you think India. You know, but actually Indian safaris are also, you know, throughout the country and for many different mammals, many different species when you're there. India has grown to 1.3 billion people, right? We have been able to save all that with the with 1.3 billion people living in the country, and our villages have expanded over time. So what has happened is that majority of our corridors are gone. There's not many corridors that are left, but if we look at examples in many other places in the world, you know, corridors are being lost in the Amazon, being lost in the Pantanal, being lost in Madagascar. You know, either they're losing it to the paper industry, all that. With 50 tiger reserves that are in the country, which are national parks, no commercial activity can ever happen in them. So whether they could find diamonds in them or they could find a mine in them or anything like that, that doesn't happen. This was an exception, which is a Kana Pench corridor that was there, where this is the only sort of last strongholds of a corridor which was quite successful. And there was a highway that needed to be built through it. And you see the picture on the left, there's like a 8-lane highway that got built, you know, through the corridor, not through the national park, but through the corridor. And this was a 10-year court battle to understand why this highway is important. And the judges ruled in saying that, listen, we will save tigers in pockets, but it cannot come at the cost of development. And that's when they started creating these green corridors, which you also see in Europe, maybe you see in America as well, where all these have underpasses where wildlife is passing, you know, and these have been cordoned off on the top. So the noise also reduces when the wildlife is passing at night. There are tons of camera traps who have, in the last 2-3 years, also captured, you know, mother and cubs crossing, wild dogs crossing, sloth bears crossing. So, you know, over time it may become successful. But having said that, we have still secured a fair percentage of land in the country for the tiger reserve. So the conservation battle in India, I think, is very interesting. I almost think it's even more successful than Africa in many, many ways, just because of the amount of engagement of the local middle class, of the people, of the community that are involved as a vested interest in saving our jungles.
Awesome. Thanks, Amit. And kind of our last point here in the difference, I want to go back to the idea of tiger tracking. You'll see a lot of photos. I mean, I know Tad loves selfies, but took a lot of selfies in the vehicle. And that's actually because we were waiting. There are times where we were waiting for 35 minutes, 40 minutes, just listening to the sounds of the jungle, being patient, looking at pug marks of the tigers. So you're having to really work for your sightings, and a lot of them were amazing, right? But this is kind of the main difference. You kind of go back to that idea that you have to look for your wildlife. They're not just going to present themselves to you like they do in the Mara, you know, where you can have one game drive and you see lions, cheetahs, and leopards in 2 hours. Right? This you have to work a little bit.
This photo is illustrates that so well, Mark, and that's Indrajit, which is one of Amit's incredible naturalist guides, one of the best guides I've been with anywhere in the world, certainly one of the greatest naturalist guides I've ever had the pleasure of spending time with. And in that picture in the upper left, or the left side, we were sitting probably for a half an hour, just taking in the sounds of the jungle and listening to a tiger call, which on its own was an exceptional experience. And we ultimately did find that tiger. And so you feel like you worked for it, and it's a great feeling of accomplishment. But it does kind of harken back to those to real game tracking. And I think that is what makes India so unique, so special, is it doesn't happen that often in Africa. There are no radios in the vehicles. Guides are not radioing each other. They are having to work for it. Yes, they do talk to each other when you pass in the park, but it's really about, again, eyes, ears, all the senses being heightened, trying to find those elusive tigers. Because again, this is a thickly forested national parks, so it is a little bit harder to see game. But when you do find that tiger after a half an hour or more of working for it, wow, what an experience. Again, getting goosebumps.